an intellectual. He does historical analysis, geopolitics, cultural analysis. He tends to look at the what's going on behind the scenes, if you will, the conspiracy aspect to world history. And Matt, you tend to connect, as you say in your show, you connect the dots by bringing up issues in an interconnected way. You're looking at the whole world, and you look at events in the context of the greater issues. You look at events in the present in the context of history. And what you're doing is very unusual. It's a great contribution, and I really appreciate it. So thanks for joining me.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me on, Charles. And I appreciate the opening remarks. And yeah, like I think the context is just so important. It changes everything. You know, the text without context is pretext, as some have said. So we often we jump into a conviction on something that opinion shapers have given us to think about, as far as like what is a narrative that will explain some element of history or something in the current world without any of the proper appreciation of what are the historical forces, what are the intentions, the agendas, the precedents, the principles that are actually at work, at play, shaping those things I'm looking at. And by ignoring it, we make half-assed decisions and make big messes throughout history. So I'm hoping that I could try to correct a little bit of that in my limited way, as I'm trying to figure things out too.
Well, you're contributing to an avoidance as best we can as individuals of World War III, if we're not already in it. And of course, you mentioned information that we have historically and today. When the people in power generally write the history books and they suppress that which doesn't fit their particular narrative. So what we're doing here, what you do, it's very difficult to sort of pierce that veil of establishmentese history and take a look at events that actually did happen, or how they've affected the way the world is. And when you try to do that, you're assaulted as a, quote, conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
When in fact, much of the edifice of the establishment is woven on their own conspiracies, and often those conspiracies are insane.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And that's the only way, as far as I've come to think about it, the only competent way to understand anything in the human world is through through recognizing the causal nature of intentions to do things based on concepts, where people, not just one, but will have a common intention with at least some common idea, whether right or wrong, and they will do things. And sometimes the things that they do that will be associated with power, with a capacity to, like obviously if you're a billionaire, you're going to be able to have a lot more capacity to do things that have a larger amplitude than somebody who's, a typical blue collar worker. It doesn't mean that that the type of effect a conspiracy of blue collar workers can have isn't very powerful. We saw that with the trucker convoy in Ottawa back in 2022. I mean, getting normal people, although that still was only successful, keep in mind, because there was some leadership, but getting normal people acting on a common idea that tyranny is wrong, freedom is better than tyranny, and I love my kids. I'm going to make sacrifices because of my love of children and my own children and humanity and my nation. And it helped that there was some wise, because this sort of thing can go anarchistic, like the Jacobin mobs that just cut the heads of everybody off and derailed a lot of potential that was good before the French Revolution turned into a bloodbath, because that was a lack of leadership. There wasn't anybody who qualified themselves philosophically to understand the terrain and teach the masses how to understand what they're operating within. Whereas at different other moments, like Martin Luther King, he was not from a rich, wealthy family, Martin Luther King Jr., but yet he was still able to invoke a very, very edifying process that made people better and more courageous, more dignified, that did change policy. It did have a permanent effect upon the continuity of history. So the same thing for the trucker convoy. You had certain people who were able to take the courageous stand of being, to take a leadership position. You had Randy Hillier, you had a few other people, and there were a variety of people who were able to still keep it in harmony, avoiding falling into the traps of provocateurs who were in as we know now, were instilled by those who wanted to turn it violent. And but all that to say, conspiracies are very important for good or for bad. I mean,
Of
it's
course.
for both. So that's what I'm trying to help people be like, both understand as both what's shaping their world, but also what they can feasibly, if they choose to, and develop their minds appropriately through understanding, participate in doing what you could consider to be a positive form of conspiracy, organize others, work in town halls, but just be a part of something that is good. Yeah.
Right. And obviously, conspiracies, as you say, I mean, first of all, it's a fact of life that people conspire. They come
Yeah.
together to work on something, and oftentimes they do it with a level of secrecy that can be required, and that can be for good or for bad.
Mm.
Good examples of conspiracies would have been right here in Boston. The Tea Party was
Mm.
a conspiracy. They got
Mm.
together secretly, and the Sons of Liberty, which actually was drawn on Masonic lines,
Mm.
and they conspired to basically overthrow the British crown, and it triggered the American Revolution.
Mm.
Another good conspiracy was the Valkyries, which was led by von Stauffenberg, which plot to assassinate Hitler. So,
Mm.
these are things. Sometimes you need a level of secrecy when you're dealing with very bad situations. But the problem with general conspiracy, I think, is that it's pervaded the establishment to such an extent that they're almost living in an alternative reality. And while there has been conspiracy elements in every generation, it's reached a level now where they can really mold the mainstream narrative in that they control enough of the means of communication, as Karl Marx called for. And I trace it in the modern sense, and this will get us into the topic I want to talk about, to what Professor Carroll Quigley talked about in the Anglo-American Establishment in his book Tragedy and Hope.
Mm.
It was the Rhodes Roundtable, and it was this idea of merging the British Commonwealth nations and the United States into a world control entity that would informally control the world, and basically by a small clique of white supremacists, essentially. You mentioned, Matt, that you can have a truth speaker stand up and say something true, and they can change the whole dynamic.
Mm.
You can go to like a local town meeting and simply make a statement of truth, and it changes everything, and it
Yeah.
blows up the whole narrative.
Yeah.
And you use as an example the Canadian truckers, and you're a Canadian activist. I want to say, as an American, thank God for the Canadian truckers. They really changed what was coming down the pike, which was these forced vaccine passports that would have eventually become digitized and would have carried all sorts of who knows what information about every single person. It would have been modeled ultimately, and there's no reason to assume otherwise, on the communist Chinese model, which is giving people a social score, which means that you can't eat unless you have a good social score. You can't travel. They were in the process of launching that, and it was stopped by the Canadian truckers. It really was. I mean, when they got up and they blocked the roads and they threatened to close the Canadian economy down, the whole thing fell apart, and that was spreading. It was spreading to the United States, Australia, New Zealand, France, even Israel. The truckers were waking up, and they had to back down. I mean, here in Boston, where I live, we had a new mayor who just the first thing she did when taking office was say that you had to have a vaccine passport to go into a restaurant or a store, and
Yes.
that the manager of those businesses would have to check your passport.
Yes.
And once the truckers came on the scene, that everybody backed away. The whole thing fell apart because nobody wants to have that kind of paralysis. And I think that it
Yes.
put them in abeyance, at least for now. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to try to come back, and it doesn't mean that they haven't put in these authoritarian laws, but at least it shows that a group of people can organize and throw enough of a light on this kind of darkness that it puts a stop to it. So I just want to say I'm grateful to those Canadian truckers.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was surprising. I didn't think that we had it in us. I didn't think our culture had the capacity to generate something like that, because in my analysis of Canadian history, it's a series of a lot of very disappointing evaluations of very bad slavish pro-monarchical judgments over the course of 250 years.
Right.
Mostly there are these little moments of brightness, of courageous sort of Republican freedom-loving sentiment that emerges from time now and again throughout the history records that mostly have been brushed or erased from collective memory by the narrative shapers of the British Empire. But the culture has been really, really made mushy by the handlers of Canada, who are located primarily, as Carol Quigley illustrates very nicely, not within Canada. There's an internationally extended roundtable organization tied to Oxford. This is actually a junior branch of a higher operating system that's more tied to Cambridge, which is sort of like the brains, whereas Oxford produces the brawn, the doers, whereas Cambridge produces not Massachusetts, but the thinkers. The Bertrand Russells, the Lord Maynard Keyneses, the grand strategists who will shape the rules of the game, in which then the Rhodes Scholars, the Fabians, will be deployed to then act within the framework of the rules shaped by the dungeon masters in the Royal Society in Cambridge. Exactly. So that's sort of the way that this whole deep state has been cultivated and groomed within America, within Canada. We've got our own many leaders who die very mysterious deaths, or just outright, assassinated before their policy vision could culminate in something really good. You'll usually find the hand of this apparatus there in some way, and anybody who's looking for it will find it, as long as, like I said, as we were talking about, you don't let go of the understanding that the principle of conspiracy, utilizing, of course, not just because conspiracy, the difficult thing for people is that it's tied to immaterial intentions. And we have a very materialist society in terms of our education system, how people are trained to conduct history research or carry out any type of political theory. There's what's called the name that's given to it is radical positivism. This idea that the truth is located in the facts. And just by accumulating the facts, you can find a pattern. You could just sort of assemble them and impose some explanation onto the model. That's incompetent. The facts are useful. Looking for patterns is useful. Those are useful things that we can do. We can use our senses to collect things that we then call facts, arrange them how we see fit on any type of, graph or whatever on a timeline. That's fine. You could take names, make an encyclopedic list of associations. That's fine. And you could look for patterns. That's good. That's okay too. But if you think that that's all you have,
well, it's dumbing down a broader picture, because you need to analyze those facts, and also who's getting to choose which facts are included and which facts are. I mean, I've talked. People tell me, I say that for example, the New York Times is biased on the left, which of course it is, and it's really the main mouthpiece for the entire establishment. Every news deliverer gets a copy, no matter where they are in this country, probably in the world. But they're biased not because of what they talk about necessarily. It's what they don't talk about. It's what they leave out that makes the bias. They decide what the public is going to hear and not hear. They choose the facts. And now we're having, I'm sure you've talked about this huge censorship campaign that's been in place, particularly since President Trump was elected. And they have these misinformation mills at the big universities, like right here at Harvard. They've got the Shorenstein Center, that they decide what's, quote, misinformation and what isn't, and they censor that which they deem to not fit this narrative. Now, of course, they also were promoting complete garbage for years, as in Putin conspired with Trump to steal the 2016 election. That was a big conspiracy theory that they had no problem with. So, this is all very selective, and it's very authoritarian in nature, and it's against the American spirit, which is competition and which is a free and open exchange of ideas. Now, my new book is The Anti-Semitic Imagination, and I talk about how anti-Semitism has been used as a tool by the establishment to divert attention from their own malfeasance. But at the same time, and how Judaism has always stood against this kind of thing, going all the way back to the battles against pagan worship and the worship of false gods and idols. And yet I also get into what I would call the Jewish deep state.
Mm.
And I see it as starting with the infiltration of this false messiah in the 16th century called Shabtai Zvi. It's very specific that he introduced this antinomian idea that whatever is good is evil, whatever is evil is good. It's very satanic, actually, in nature. And
This
that
is pre-Sabbatean?
this is the
Is this pre?
this is the founder of the Sabbateans.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah. All right, all right.
17th century, and he
Okay, yeah.
he was after he was exposed. He said that if we create such degradation and such debauchery and such evil in the world, then the Messiah will come to save the world, which is the exact opposite of the Jewish conception and the Christian conception. I mean, Jesus came to fulfill the Torah and to uphold the moral and ethical precepts of God's writ.
Right.
It's a complete, it was a complete heresy. And yet, after he was exposed as a fraud, his followers, many of them, most of the people dropped out of it, but an elite group of them went underground and they formed this Sabbatean society. And that it's that society that has struggled to take over Judaism. It's been a kind of a quiet.
Yeah, Jacob Frank and all that.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, no, well, but the thing that I think, because that's something that people will encounter very, very quickly in doing some of this research, is the Sabbateans and the Frankists afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly a serious issue. But it's the more I look at at this history from this lens of the occult and how the occult has been at the heart of the creation and practice of the various intelligence agencies, the migration of imperial agencies from location to location. Obviously, when Rome collapsed, a lot of the leading families, I mean, a couple of them might have disappeared. The patrician families. A lot of them stayed in power, but they migrated. Some of them stayed within Rome, tried to use and reconstruct the system of the demigod emperor in the form of the Pope, utilizing certain forgeries like the donation of Constantine that we later discovered was a forgery, which posits that it was like an apocryphal sort of story that Constantine gave the papacy full authority over the material domain, which also was the legal basis upon which the papal states were later on justified, as well as the spiritual domain. So again, they wanted to sort of use a new form of Roman emperor in that form for a while. And so some of the families stayed around Rome, tried to reconstruct it that way. Other families either moved their possessions, their assets as much as they could carry from the West into Constantinople. A lot of them, though, the most virulent ones that I could see that were carrying on the higher initiated rites of the priesthood that controlled things like Mithra, the Mithraic cult, or the mystery religion, as well as Cybele and Attis. They migrated into Venice through a series of steps under certain Christian veneers, but not really. If you look at it, it was always satanic. And these are the same types of Satanists who were trying to destroy Christianity earlier on with the Gnostic Christians, synthetic sects that were created as sort of pseudo-Mithraic, pseudo-Sibelian sects before, in the 2nd, 3rd century. And they were trying to destroy it from within, like introducing like blood drinking, human sacrifice, things like that within their higher rites of initiation, which would then natural as saying, yes, we're doing the eating of the flesh of Jesus, and it's actual flesh. And obviously this was horrific,
of course,
for the Roman population, where they're like, that's Christianity, yeah, burn it. So you had this whole thing where the Roman people were being played against Christianity at different times was being played by the various forces within the higher cults that often ran the most emperors and the legions, which were always members of the cult of Mithra. They were being played against the Jews at different times. The Jews were being played against the Christians at different times. The people, the masses who weren't on either side, were being played against both.
It's the British idea of divide and conquer, basically. And
well, yeah, it precedes the British Empire, and this is what took over the British Empire via the Venetian transit, where Venice was the pre-British Empire global system of evil. And at a certain point, when that became too weak, they had to migrate, transfer their institutions, their operating base to the British Isles and to Amsterdam. And this is what the founding fathers were fighting against, was this agency that by this time was manifesting in things like the Hellfire Club. You know, that was the entire British government were members of the Hellfire Club before and during the American Revolution. That was as one of the leading members had even said, where they were practicing within caverns, the catacombs, which is where the Mithraic ceremonies
underneath Rome, right?
Well, they still have them underneath Rome. There's about 600 that have been uncovered, excavated, that are all over Europe, into Russia, North Africa, even the Middle East, Syria. There's Mithraeum.
It's like
but
a
there was one also
society.
under. Yeah, it's like the Tunnel Society, where they do all their ritual. Yeah, and it could take on a this is where Francis Dashwood, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, had set up his catacombs under the I think it's Medmenham Castle, where Benjamin Franklin had to infiltrate and get intelligence back to Cotton Mather and the Patriots in America at the time, to get a sense of like, well, what is this thing that has outlets within America? Like Ben Franklin's older brother was running a chapter of the Hellfire Club in Boston, or is it Philadelphia now? I'm forgetting. Anyway,
I think it was Philadelphia.
Yeah, but you had like 13 of these chapters of the Hellfire Club in the 1720s, 1730s being set up across the colonies to bring in this Satanism. And so the satanic Gnostic ancient mystery cults they're highly adaptable. They can create ones with Kabbalistic Jewish flavor, with Christian flavor, with Muslim flavor. They know how to create cults. And then what happens is that the people who get burned by their activity will then hate the form, that the package that they created, the Jewish package, the Christian package, the Muslim package, and they will not see that, no, this is actually all equally satanic mystery cults masquerading.
Right, that they're all kind of interconnected, and that they're going to shift the blame onto actually the enemies of those cults. And I'd note that a lot of people who look at this sort of conspiracy, I think, probably accurately trace it back to Mystery Babylon and to the ancient idol worshiping cults that ran these societies. And that in the modern sense, Christianity, it may be in spite of these cults, I think in spite of these cults, has been a force of goodness in the world, because it teaches that the individual derives his rights from the Creator, and that Jesus is the intercessor, and that the Torah says that you know men and women are created in the image of God, and that we derive our rights from God, not from the state. So, in spite of their efforts at control, and it's a fascinating subject, and we need to keep an eye on it, they've set in motion ideas that they can't control. And I think that was also true of the founding of the United States, because I wonder, when I see things like the all-seeing eye on the American seal, and the Hellfire Clubs that you talk about, I mean, I think that there might have been an element of that kind of Masonic secretiveness that was part of the agenda of the founding fathers. Even, I don't know that, but either way, and even maybe what? Yeah.
Oh no. Well,
no, I was just going to. I was just going to say that either way, whether or not they were part of any kind of conspiracy, maybe inadvertently, maybe deliberately, they set in motion an advance of individual freedom. And that's, in a sense, it was a further flowering of Christian culture, which was emanated from Jewish culture, which is that we derive our rights from the Creator and not from the state. Our rights are inherent, or natural rights, as some of the great Enlightenment figures talked about, and that the state is nothing more than an apparatus to protect those rights, and that it operates in a sense in a very strict paradigm, which is why we have a constitution. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, the thing, I wrote a series of books called The Clash of the Two Americas, to try to make as transparent as possible my understanding of the United States as something very beautiful but unfulfilled, right? So that's why the first of the book of the series is the Unfinished Symphony, which I like as a metaphor, because it does get across. I selected that because it gets across a resolution to this false debate where you either have people who absolutely love everything about America and they are so willing to they have a cognitive dissonance over even acknowledging any evil that was ever done by the United States, both as a Pax Americana empire that's overthrown something like 200 governments in the past 80 years
Right.
to maintain a system of empire, a lot of evil, a lot of blood, a lot of unjust wars of the 18th century. Well,
Hmm.
so they can't see that because they're so immersed within the exceptionalism of that mythos. We're just the exceptional people. There's this superiority complex,
Mm.
which is dangerous when you let your mind go there. The other one is the other grouping can only hate America, can only see the bad, can only see slavery, can only see hypocrisy. They can't see anything good. And it's like what I try to do is both recognize the evil, because it's like, you got to as an alcoholic, you got to first admit you got a problem, but you're trying to get back to your true self, right? And then also look at, well, where all of the points of wonderful goodness that emerged throughout the course of the past 250 years of the American experience. And so you can then get a sense that a lot of the evil was done or can be accounted for by this unrepentant British Empire and its apparatus, which never left after 1776. It has worked
Hmm.
to corrupt the people, to corrupt the agencies, the agencies of control, and you could do the same thing for masonry as well. So these more older institutions, because this is a new institution, right,
Hmm.
America, but
Right.
the older institutions, I've got one of my friends, Gerald Therrien. He's writing a book right now on the
Hmm.
clash of the two Britons, getting at the fact that before this parasite latched on and started taking over England, starting especially with Henry VIII and his Venetian advisors that induced
Hmm.
him to create things like the Anglican Church with the hereditary bloodline as the new pope. This was a Venetian operation inside of England
Mm.
that derailed a lot of but there were a lot of very powerful, good people, like Thomas More, who got his head cut off.
Right.
Many other good Republican patriots within Britain, within England, who have to be. We end up hating Britain so much that we forget. Like a lot of American patriots, they despise Britain for all of its hypocrisy, pomp, and evil, and they forget, no, there's actually this current of goodness. William Penn, a lot of the reason why you have Pennsylvania is William Penn, who was he was anti-imperial. He had a very different idea of what empire meant based upon the common good, cultivating
Right.
good relations with the natives and the settlers, and so this is where the American experience is largely, you could see it as the effect of a civil war within England. Is an English civil war.
Interesting.
The founding fathers were they saw themselves as British subjects,
Sure.
but they were representing the better traditions of Britain. Now, just so same thing, Clash of the Two Britons, but same thing too for the Clash of the Two Masonries. Increasingly, what you see is that throughout history, in deep history, you have those who have, it appears, utilized the need for secrecy, but also the idea of within masonry around there's certain common ideas that you kind of have to be stupid not to agree with, like um, um a brotherhood of human beings.
Right.
There's a
Right.
lot of very good things as an
Of course.
ideal, which are there. The idea that there is a law above and a law below, a law of man that has to accommodate the law of God, which is also an ideal within masonry. But the problem is that these satanic mystery cults also
Right.
have utilized Masonic agencies, right? Especially the Rosicrucians that took over, created the modern British Masonry and a lot of the lodges. But you have on the one hand, and I got this originally, this idea that hasn't been proven wrong, from Lyndon LaRouche originally in 1978 or 79. He wrote a paper on the secrets known only to the inner elites. And his thesis was solid. It was provocative, and I like I said, I haven't been able to disprove this.
Hmm.
But on the cover of this magazine called The Campaigner, there's like Aristotle and Plato, being ripped apart, and they're in a disputation from the school of Athens.
Right.
And he makes the point that you have the Platonists and the Aristotelian or Neoplatonists as two opposing schools expressing themselves throughout the institutions historically, so oftentimes within Masonic organizations, lodges. And on the one hand, one could be considered the nation builders, the city builders.
Right.
That goes back to Solon, who studied in Egypt at the Temple of Ammon. Moses was also in Egypt, and if you were from a noble family within the Egyptian upper class, you would have
Indeed.
gotten a sort of experience going through the mystery schools in some degree, but not all. But also Plato and Pythagoras also studied in Egypt, probably the Temple of Ammon at the time before it became totally corrupt, which would have been a place where, as Friedrich Schiller got at it in an essay, or actually it was a lecture in 1793 or 1791 on the mission of Moses. He's doing an analysis in this lecture on universal history and the corruption of Masonry, but how originally one could have seen how the idea of one creator, one cause, as subsuming all other pantheistic or polytheistic considerations of many creators, good and evil, which was dominant in the pre-monotheistic world, that would have emerged easily if you had like looking at the Pyramid of Giza, for example. It's an observatory. It's tuned to the cycles of the precession of the equinox, to the solstice, to a variety of things. But the idea that when you look at the night sky, that there is like one harmony of the night sky. You could follow the stars, you could follow their cycles over the course of a year, over the course of many years, and you could start seeing that there's this unifying principle, which would have been very heretical and dangerous to just come out in a polytheistic world and say, oh yeah, there's only one cause of all of this. That's
Right.
all of your sacred myths are actually wrong because there's one God, not many gods. That will get you killed. So the need to put or to have sort of rites of initiation would have lawfully have emerged in order to vet people. You can't just jump from grade 1 to grade 10. You're expected to make certain discoveries along the way before you can understand. Yeah, exactly. But then with secrecy comes corruption as well, easily, because now you have the seeds of power where you can just add more degrees. You can start adding more coloring to the sacred stories that then are more beneficial to maintaining power than to actually helping people attain higher knowledge, which philosopher kings must. So you could see that there would be these things. And the last thing I would say, there's evidence of massive battles within lodges throughout history, and especially the time of the 18th, 19th century.
Right.
There were hundreds of different lodges, and there were life and death battles between factions on the one hand who believed that man is God, that at the end of the day, we are God. And by the way, God is evil. And we're made in the image of that evil God, and we are thus that God.
that's the Sabatian theory, and it's also the roots of Marxism, I would note. And I think that what you're describing regarding the difference between Plato and Aristotle, that was also articulated by Ayn Rand. That was one of her basic theories, that Plato was the author of the Republic. It was a hyperstate that would have complete order and control over who lived and who died. I mean, in the ancient Greek society, a baby would be, after the baby was born, you'd have a group of judges decide whether that baby was going to live or die, and if it was going to be utilized by the state. And if it was decided the baby would die, they'd put it off on the side of a mountain. And that ultimately people would grow up to either be soldiers, merchants. They would it was a total state control. And that Ayn Rand's theory is that is really the progenitor to communism, whereas Aristotle believed in the primus mobile, the creator of the universe, although she was a radical atheist, putting that aside, that there's one source of reality, one creator of the universe, and that the individual answers to that creator and not to the state.
Well, there's a problem in that. I partially agree with her and I partially don't, because on the one hand, Plato is exposing people. Often they mistake what he's doing in the Republic and they treat it like he's offering a prescription of what we should all be doing, which is not what he's doing. He's exposing the actual, he's saying the quiet part out loud, the thing you're not supposed to say. He's telling you exactly all of the oligarchy's techniques of control, what model they're using, how they work. And he's writing this as well for his academy, for his students, who he's trying to create philosopher kings and advisors to philosopher kings. So he's creating an exercise for his students to think through political intelligence and how to actually understand evil, how to understand the oligarchy. And the Ayn Rand ignores the preamble of that whole dialogue of 13 books or 12 books, which is book 1 with his battle on justice with Thrasymachus versus Socrates, where he proves, that the Hobbesian might makes right of Thrasymachus is incompetent and not the way to organize society.
Right.
And then he takes you through a bunch of exercises. The other thing on Aristotle, so Plato's exposing the methods of the evil, which is why you'll always find that the best fighters of the satanic faction of the oligarchy throughout history are always Platonists. They're using the Platonic method. And the thing about Aristotle, his idea of prima mobile, because Plato had his own prima mobile too in the Timaeus and in the Phaedo dialogue on the immortality of the soul and on the nature of the creator. Plato's is a highly active creative force, like a god that is both supramundana but also mundana, so both through the world but also not contained by the laws necessarily of the world, but both, and is present in every moment, in every part of the universe that is creation, that is harmonic, reasonable, good, and loving. Whereas the Aristotle prima mobile is the unmoved mover, the creator that created the world, but is now made the world so perfect that the creator is now incapable,
is outside of the world
to have influence.
It's kind of like
exactly.
It's kind of like deism, and also ultimately the Aristotelian idea was synthesized with the Judaic idea that God is the author of moral and ethical reality and a moral and ethical code. And that was synthesized mainly in the Gospel of John, which is, of course, the 4th book of the New Testament, where he talked about logos, which, of course, is a description of the order of society, the order of the universe. That basically was merged with the Greek concept. But to bring things up in terms of Masonry, my understanding is that it was infiltrated by the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt in the 1780s, once his secret society, which emanated out of the University of Ingolstadt in Munich, was exposed by Bavarian authorities, and that the idea that he was into was this idea of ultimately abolishing all clerisy and all sovereignty and creating this kind of international ant colony or whatever. And whatever, like kind of where people would be semi-lobotomized and we would all be part of a cog in a wheel. And that George Washington was alerted to this by a preacher in Boston by the name of Schneider, who said, "Are you aware that the Illuminati might have infiltrated your lodge in Alexandria, Virginia?" And Washington sent him back a letter saying, "I am aware of the Illuminati, and I do not believe that they're here. They did not infiltrate my lodge." And it's actually a letter that is on display at the Masonic Lodge in Alexandria, Virginia today. So this is history. But the point is that Masonry played, I think, generally a positive role in the founding of the United States. And the question is that even if it didn't, the positive ideas of it were embraced by average citizens to such a degree that this internationalist-oriented, illuminated, if you will, establishment, however you want to describe it, they've not been able to really control the high ground. They maybe have tried, but they have to operate within the societies that they function and conform themselves to those societies. And in the case of the United States, they've not been successful so far.
Yeah. Well, okay, so there's a point that ties in both with the previous thought and this one. Aristotle, Plato, and this thought regarding the manifestations of the different dynamics within opposing lodges. So one thing I forgot to mention regarding Aristotle within his politics is the concept that within natural law, we have to presume that there are masters and slaves. So built into natural law and the fabric thus of human social organization, we have to presume, because in Aristotle's world, his logic is, well, there are slaves now. There are people who are thus, he says, born slaves, and people who are born masters, at which we have to presume as an immutable fact of creation, which will always be as a universal. Now, that right there is toxic and poison. If we make that a rule, right? Like it's like Marx coming out saying, well, because there is injustice and social turmoil of the proletariat and those who control capital, that is an immutable fact. The class struggle
Eventually,
is
it was proven to be not so. But I would just only note that in Aristotle's time, slavery was the economic system. I mean, most people were at some level slaves, as opposed to free laborers. And so we would have to look at it in the context of the times. I mean, but yeah, I mean, I know what you mean. I mean,
yeah, you know what I'm saying, right? So like
yeah.
the idea that you would make it a general universal law is very dangerous,
Sure.
versus simply recognizing that, okay, we're addicted to this practice, though it's like the founding fathers, like they agreed, at least when they were setting up the new nation, that, okay, this is ultimately wrong. The British got us addicted to this form of economic wiring, because slavery was in America, not because the Americans like voted and wanted slaves. It was like
it was imposed on America by the British.
Yeah.
I mean,
the British Africa Company was dumping slaves in from the Portuguese. I mean, it was, and then they were addicted to it. Like it's like you were born to an addiction, and there was an understanding that, okay, we have to wean ourselves off of this, because all men really are created equal. So they were like, okay, within 20 years, we're gonna act upon this agreement now, this contract, to stop importing new slaves. We're gonna make this illegal in already. I think half the states or new colonies were already in agreement. We're gonna not have this at all.
That's right.
So everybody it was on the way out, and there was a lot of effort to get the addict back into the drug, and that was like a lot of the opium slave running families that became
literally. That's right. What the British India Company did to China. Right. I mean, the opium
exactly.
wars,
It all
opening the thing
exactly.
up.
It all played into that.
A lot of big merchants in the establishment in Boston made a lot of money from that. Like
and their families became.
and whatnot.
These are the junior aristocratic families modeling themselves off of the British high ethic that have their little castles and they have their little manors in England as well, and they try to model their accents off of the British.
They were very, very Anglophilic.
Super Anglophile. Yeah, the Pilgrim Society it comes out of this whole thing that interfaces with the Round Table movement in America, the CFR. So all that stuff, all that to say, so Aristotle's position on slavery is really gross, and his idea also of the tabula rasa, that we're born with as a blank slate, later taken up by John Locke, who, by the way, also was a director for the British Royal Africa
is that right?
Company. Yeah,
well, he said
John Locke,
everyone life is short and brutish, I think was his quote.
Yeah, no, he was a high-level British imperialist who really despised the idea that all men are created equal, made in the living image of God. He was not on that board. He was on the other side, and that's why he was more than happy. Also, helping write legislation that banned the development of manufacturing in the colonies in the early 1800s. So John Locke we've been lied to by the myth makers who've taken over control of our society to have us believe that British imperial blank slaters who promoted slavery were the inspiration for the American founding fathers, which is not true. There were some founding fathers who, like Locke, like Jefferson, who had a problem with his love of slavery, which he did have a problem with that. But he was not a mover of the process. He was somebody who was kind of like his foot was had 2 feet in two worlds.
And at the end of the day, he was a patriot, even though he was.
At the end of the day, he was a patriot, right?
He still had some of these agrarian, imperialist approaches, and a lot of his battle with Hamilton was based on that. But I want to bring things up to the nationalist movement, which is the most, I think, progressive movement man.
But the Illuminati thing. So just quick before we do the nationalist thing. So the thing that I've noticed so far is that, well, one, the big purge of American lodges, like the patriotic lodges, happened through a Masonic operation in the 1820s that lasted until the 1840s. It was a while. It was a huge all-out like war.
Was this to do with Albert Pike?
Albert Pike did play a role in this, and in his
Uh-huh.
Morals and Dogma, he speaks quite favorably upon this, actually.
Right.
But there's a guy named William Morgan. You heard about William
Oh
Morgan?
yeah, sure. I mean, he was the assassination or the disappearance of Morgan led to the Anti-Masonic Party that
Yeah,
was
exactly.
headed by John Quincy Adams, who wrote some incredible documents railing against it.
Well, I have, Quincy Adams' writings on it. I think he got pulled into something that he didn't fully understand, but
Okay.
it does seem to be that that was a coup of the most satanic evil of the lodges, and all of the patriotic lodges were almost totally annihilated throughout that process, and
in
only
upstate New
the
York.
Scottish Rite. Yeah, exactly. And only the Scottish Rite with its northern and southern branch came out as the king of all lodges by the end of that process by the 1840s. They were the only ones to come out and dominate everything else. And all of the good ones, like that Henry Clay, the protectionists, the Whigs, the people that were fighting to get people like Zachary Taylor or William Harrison in power, they were wiped out. Now, the thing about William Morgan that I was noticing, because this is around the same time that you had British intelligence and there was this core Gnostic cluster of intel operatives that were working around the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1820s to revive a Jesuitical thesis by, I forget his name all of a sudden. But there was this thesis that was put forth at the Council of Trent in the 1860s, 70s that was based upon an interpretation of end times theology or end times prophecy around this idea that it would accompany certain things like the convincing all the world Jewry to go to a certain place back in the Holy Land, the reconstruction of Solomon's Temple. And if you do all of these things, then the end times will come in some cataclysm and something good will happen maybe afterwards, So, but this is a Jesuitical thing that was part of a whole operation in the 16th century that was shady business. This thesis was forgotten mostly and then revived in a big way. It took on some weird forms with Oliver Cromwell, and his circle was infested by some of this stupidity. But then it came back in a virulent way in the 1820s with the Aylesbury Conference in Britain. And Thomas Carlyle was a leading figure within this thing, and the idea was to create a massive surge of synthetic pseudo-Christian Gnostic cults. That you had the New Apostolic Church. You had. It seems like the Mormon groupings were brought into America through this process,
and they're very secretive. The Mormons.
Oh, highly, yeah. It's a Gnostic cult,
and I think that they also came about around the same time as Henry Morgan.
Oh yeah, and here's the thing. Here's where it gets weird, right? So Morgan, all of a sudden, he's never proven to die. What he does is he's a loudmouth who's got a really bad reputation as like a scam artist. He all of a sudden says, "Okay, by the way, I'm a Grandmaster Freemason. I went through all the rites of initiation, and I'm going to write a book exposing everything." And he's really loud everywhere he goes. He can't stop talking about that. And right there, that's a bit weird. Now that being said, the press agencies are covering him like they're making him like a star, and all of a sudden he disappears. He doesn't like, nobody knows where he is. So obviously he's dead, right? That's the thesis everyone says. Now he's dead. Now I'm not convinced he died. I think the whole thing was a theater. What happens immediately?
He went to Canada, right?
Maybe.
Yeah,
maybe. Canada plays a weird role in this whole thing,
sure.
But I think he probably went to a Mormon commune, because the Mormons were also gearing up to do their own civil war in America. They had their whole like little war,
with
the federal
Missouri.
government.
Yeah.
And they had their whole idea of Zion as well, in America as the Garden of Eden, sort of. It's weird, but all I have to say, and it's an alien cult too. They believe that God lives on Cobol, but
right.
All I have to say, yeah, and we all get a planet if we're part of the higher initiated class within the Mormon groupings, because there's lower and higher, like an exoteric and esoteric schooling within Mormonism, and if you're part of the upper class, then you get your own planet apparently. All that to say. So this initiates this massive crackdown, right? Like everybody's going ballistic on the Masons are evil, and everything is oversimplified, and you can't, like, all the lodges get hammered. Henry
Right.
Clay, the Whigs, who are many of them are operating through the lodges, get hammered. Now Morgan, his wife, immediately becomes of all of the people in America, she goes to a Mormon commune and becomes one of the wives of Joseph
Smith.
She
Yeah.
becomes a Smith wife
Okay,
immediately.
yeah, which I think he had like almost a harem of wives.
He had a harem. He had his harem.
Yeah, he did.
And so did Brigham Young. But
Yes.
so she becomes a Smith wife.
Okay.
And then what's really weird is, like, 18 years later, so for some people within the Mormon practice, you do a baptism after somebody dies, right? Not for everybody, but for some people.
Right.
The Mormons end up they do a baptismal ceremony for William Morgan. 18 years after he supposedly died in 1826.
That's very telling.
Yeah. So, and this thing's just coming out on so many levels. So now at this point, and then Albert Pike later on writes in his Morals and Dogma of what a positive thing this whole anti-Masonic movement was, and he's talking about how the dupes and the fools on the lower levels will do things that actually will benefit those higher Luciferians that are in the know.
Not to throw another log on the fire, but this is also around the time that Andrew Jackson suspended or refused to renew the charter for the Second Bank of the United States, which is a whole big subject. We're kind of reaching toward the end of the show, so I want to, and there's so much, we're just getting started.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like amazing. I mean, you are like a walking encyclopedia. I mean, it's incredible, your knowledge and your synthesis of stuff. It's great.
Well, thanks,
man. Like
man.
to have you back and do regular programming here. But I want to talk about Zionism and nationalism a little bit, because that's one of the topics in my book. The nationalist movement was, I think, the most progressive in history. It was the ability of a group of people to control their own lives and destinies through the establishment of governments and nation states by which people would share certain commonalities of culture, language, faith, and other aspects, and that they would then have this kind of sovereignty and be able to exercise that kind of control. That's what Zionism is for the Jewish people. And I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories around it as being some kind of a world control thing. And you've got this complete misinterpretation of this concept in Judaism of the chosen people, which is in a way the same misinterpretation that Americans have of manifest destiny. That's not the purpose of the idea. The idea of the chosenness is that the Jews were called at the foot of Sinai to serve God, not to control anyone, not to control man, but to take on an extra layer of responsibility, things like, dietary laws and rituals, so that they could be closer to God, so that they could raise their spirituality and thus be an example to all of mankind. And that, in a sense, if you look at the Jewish history, the Jews have always bucked establishments, and they've always been very individual oriented. They've prized education and family and moral values. And Zionism has been a thread that's run through Jewish history. I get into every century how Jews have tried to reassert control over that miserable piece of beachfront that we call Israel. And why God chose that, who knows? That's a question that's beyond my pay scale, but that's what we were commanded to do in the Torah. Nothing more and nothing less. Take possession of that tiny strip of territory between the river and the sea, as the Palestinians like to say, except obviously for the Jewish people. And I think there's been, does Israel have a deep state? Yes. Israel knows how to play ball with the deep staters. They always did. They know how to get benefits from the Rothschild family. They knew how to play ball with all of these, the Rhodes Roundtable people. But the only difference, and it's bad, and some of the stuff they did is very unsavory, even to this day. But the only difference I would make is that their goals are very modest. It's to preserve that tiny speck of land, that society that they've built there, against what I would argue are genocidal forces. And if you look at Israel today, they have created this dynamic nationalist entity that's both spiritual and political. And that it's, if the Arab street would wake up and realize that they should do the same in their own countries rather than focus on this irrational hatred of Israel, then they would have independent, sovereign societies. And I get into the history of how originally the Arab leaders wanted to do this with Israel and how they were subverted by this internationalist order. Anyway,
Well,
thank you for humoring me.
what I would say, yeah,
Yeah.
what I would say, there was Yossi Beilin, the former justice minister, gave an interview in, I think it was 2003. I want to say, when he was trying to revive an Oslo 2 that had been derailed earlier in the 90s through the murder of Rabin. And I think Yasser Arafat hadn't been killed yet, but there was a grouping that did forensic analysis upon his bones that were exhumed and proved that there was polonium poisoning there. So it seems like Arafat's death also wasn't so natural. Obviously, Yitzhak Rabin being murdered it destroyed a lot of potential. And it wasn't, people are like, oh, it was obviously, terrorists. And it's like, well, it's crazy ass Rabbi Cook follower.
No, look, these things don't happen by accident. I
yeah. And Yossi Beilin, the point he made is, look, we wanted to create a homeland, a sanctuary for Jews to be safe, not a new Masada cult. And I thought that was an important lesson, because he is, as well as Yitzhak, his former boss and friend, was aware that there was this blood and soil cult that had been incubated throughout the century, and was very, very dangerous if that got out of hand.
Okay.
And remember how I was saying that there could be a book on the clash of the two Britons, or the clash of the two Englands, there could be a clash of the two Zions too, I think, there's this important need to map out the structure of the occult satanic agencies masquerading as Judaism. And I believe that Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, from all of my analysis of this character, was a Satanist, the worst kind of Kabbalist. Not. I believe that there's a school of good Kabbalism. I'm open to that, but this guy
he might have been a follower of Shabtai Zvi, possibly.
I'm feeling like it smells like it, and that's why the British Empire installed him in 1919 as the lead rabbi of Ashkenaz Jews in Palestine, and and they also co-installed Haj Amin at the same time.
Exactly,
which was
it's classic British policy of picking the radicals on both sides to control the argument.
Exactly. And if in my mapping of things, when I look at these different, like Jabotinsky was brought in first. He was working with Trotsky directly in Ukraine and Russia as part of this whole Wall Street, color revolutionary operation to undermine Russia and the Romanovs and the broader global dynamic that Russia was participating in, as far as like setting up the stage for a world of cooperation based on American system practices of Russian versions of greenback, state banks, protectionism, building rail industrial corridors to elevate people from being serfs to becoming like active participating citizens with minds. So that was going on in Russia. That had to be undone. So
that was already. You're right. Let me just interrupt. I mean, you're right that under the last Romanovs, Russia, there was a middle class emerging, and that they were moving, I think, rapidly toward a truly great sovereign state, and it was undone by this conspiracy to by the Bolsheviks, so called.
Yes. So all that to say, like looking at the different, so you had Parvis, Alexander Helfand Parvis, who on the one hand was one of the trio working with Trotsky, setting up things like the Young Turks operating through a Mazzini Lodge run by Mazzini's grandson at the time in Cyprus, which managed a big chunk of the Young Turk operation to destabilize Russia's underbelly before World War I even started, and set the groundwork, utilizing as well what became Muslim Brotherhood operations, which is a Freemasonic lodge as well, and fusing money and drugs from his controllers down into that zone. Then on the other hand, you had Jabotinsky doing something kind of similar, trying to like model himself off of a fascist structure of Mussolini's Italy, which what's his name, David Ben Gurion called Jabotinsky Vladimir Hitler for a reason, because he was, you look at what the Irgun and the was doing, along with Rabbi Kook's operatives. They were pushing a very Ubermenschen mode of organizing society, and at different times would carry out mass atrocities against the Arabs who've been living there, and at different times Haj Amin was inducing useful idiots to carry out massive atrocities against Jews. And again, they just wanted to incubate eye for an eye type of baggage, which they've been able to successfully do for a century. So we've been played a lot. And that's my whole point, is that whenever I speak to an Arab audience or a Jewish audience or a Christian audience, I'm always trying to get people to appreciate how we've all been played by the same satanic force of ancient mystery cults at the end of the day that we have to be aware of.
And
have that conversation first, and then it'll exactly.
No, I make the same point in my book, and I just would note that Zionism itself is an organic, dynamic movement. I mean, in the same way that the American movement, the Patriot movement, was such, and that you always have these people, and as you point out, that are at very high levels, who are involved with interconnecting secret societies all around the world, who try to manipulate it for their own agendas, and all sides are hurt by that. Obviously, certainly that's the case with Israel and Palestine. So,
well, love God, love your fellow man, the golden rule. I mean, to the degree that we live our lives that way and we organize our laws, then I think that whatever nations we create gain legitimacy in what the Chinese call the mandate of heaven. To the degree that we're defiant of those principles of God's law, and then we lose the mandate to have validity to our nation and ourselves. So if we uphold those principles, we're good. We can fight the oligarchy, and whether it's Israel or the USA gains authenticity and a legitimate right to be a true nation in the Brotherhood of Nations, and if not, we can all become corrupt as well. So it's the moral mandate is on all of us to maintain that morality in our worlds. So that's my position on the whole thing.
And I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's our job to try to use our agency to expose and identify the nature of this general conspiracy, this evil conspiracy, what Whittaker Chambers called this conspiracy of gentlemen. Basically, it's not necessarily that they're not all sitting around in a smoke-filled room somewhere plotting. They all don't necessarily agree with each other. In fact, some of the biggest wars have been between the rivalries within this conspiracy, but they all possess and they advocate an unnatural agenda, one that undermines the idea of man as created in the image of God and answering to God. Anyway, Matt, Eric, I want to thank you for joining me. What a great conversation. Please listen, this is amazing. Please let my listeners and viewers know where they can find out information about you and about where you do your thing.
Well, sure, yeah. Okay, so they can go to CanadianPatriot.org for my more geopolitical history stuff. It's not just me. I mean, it's a web platform I've made back in 2012. Also, all of my books are available for purchase, easy to find on there. And our new videos, we've been doing documentary films now for about a year and a half, and that's going well. So we always make those free for people to watch and share. The risingtidefoundation.net is more educational, cultural warfare stuff that I set up with my wife, who's the president back in 2019. So that's what we do: weekly meetings, seminars, study groups of original texts. We just did Rabbi Philo of Alexandria's.
Oh yeah, sure.
On creation.
Excellent.
And now we're currently reading some Plato. So if people want to get involved with that, send us an email at info@risingtidefoundation.net. And lastly, Substack. So sort of what's saved us financially speaking, since a lot of
the demonetizing,
our
right?
revenue has been, exactly.
Yeah, we've all had that.
Has been Substack.
Sure.
Yeah, we've all experienced that. So Substack's good, and there's free and paid upgrades, and that's matthewarrett.substack.com.
All right, Matt, listen, it's been a great pleasure and honor, and I hope you come back sometime, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so
Amen.
much.